Love is the only cement that can hold this broken community together. And when I am commanded to love, I'm commanded to restore community, to resist injustice, and to meet the needs of my brothers. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Nearly 10 years ago, I moved into a part of Oakland they were calling the kill zone. It's the area where the majority of the homicides occur. I moved in with my wife and 3 daughters, 8, 5, and 4. I didn't grow up in a difficult neighborhood, although I spent plenty of time in difficult neighborhoods. I showed up with somewhat of a messianic idea that I would somehow be coming to change the city. Was humbled over the course of time to realize the city was changing me. I came because in our city we had 148 murders in a city population of 400,000. And at that time, the vocation that I had did not provide me the opportunity to add the necessary value. The pain was too far away from me. I was too misinformed. I was too intoxicated with my own solutions. So as I started down the journey of reducing violence in our city, that meant I'd have to do so in partnership with local law enforcement agencies. That was a particularly difficult reality for me, considering the only gun I've stared down is that of a police officer when I was 18 years old, putting myself through college, working a night job to pay off my tuition. My brother was beat up by the police when he was in college. My father was arrested by the police marching with Dr. King as a middle school student. My great uncle was killed by the Ku Klux Klan. It was rumored in the neighborhood that they were off-duty police officers. So there I stood 20 years later from my own story in the lobby of our police administration building on my way up to the office with the police chief. I stepped into the elevator and 4 officers in their blues got in the elevator with me, and I became immediately nervous. Some of you all might say, well, Ben, if you're going to feel nervous, you should have felt nervous over there in the kill zone where all the homicides are happening. But here I stood in the elevator, nervous, on my way up to the office of our city's police chief. You see, the historical and generational effects of policing in communities of color have created an ecosystem of mistrust. And that meant for me that if I was going to go down the journey of reducing violence, I was going to also have to travel the journey of discovering partnership. Now, one of the things that was interesting when I showed up at the partnership table was that I wasn't the only one that was coming to the table with anxiety and cynicism. Law enforcement partners were showing up in the same way. We didn't really want to sit down together at the table. We sat down because we had no other option. I didn't trust them. They didn't trust me. Centuries of racial history and failed policies, our own personal experiences did not present for us the necessary margin for reimagination. But we didn't focus about what we disagreed about, but rather the things we shared in common. We both wanted to keep people alive. We both wanted the respective members of our communities to go home safe at the end of every day. We partnered not because we wanted to, but because we had to. You see, partnership is very difficult, particularly when you're trying to partner with those whom you deem as the other, because it forces you to lean into this idea I like to call shared awkwardness. There's some things you don't want to do, but you have to do, and the only way you're going to do them is together. Shared awkwardness. So in 2014, I launched my organization after leaving an organization I had been at, and I launched Empower Initiative to create a hub of social innovators that would work around public safety and the intersection of race in our society. And I began to work in partnership with our local law enforcement agency in a much more deeper way. For many of my loved ones in the community, I was too close to the police. Then after the Ferguson uprising, and I spent time in Ferguson, I then began to join and make my home a lot more with our young people who were protesting in the streets, calling for accountability. And for many in law enforcement, I was too close to the community. See, one of the realities that we're challenged with in partnership is this pre-existing socialization that we all have to think in binaries. You're either with us or you're with them. If you are celebrating who we are, then you obviously must be critiquing who they are. But the reality is the only way we're going to sit down at the table with one another is going to be inclusive of the debate. It's going to recognize that it's going to include some fiery critique. But the question is, do we have the moral courage to sit down at the table, not when we all agree with one another, but when we actually disagree with one another the most? Can we recognize that we're all showing up in different shoes to the same intersection of our story, and that everyone's perspective is genuine? Can we recognize that when some of us are criticizing institutions, it is not by default a criticism of individual human beings? Can we be more committed to trying to find out how to reform our institutions rather than just being so hell-bent on defending the status quo? I told you all I showed up in my city years ago and was finding my way to do work across the city. And one day I drove and got back in front of my house and parked. And I looked across the street from my home, and there was our neighborhood street pharmacist who was across the street. And he was open for business. And I felt divinely inspired to go talk to him. And I told God no, right? I'm a religious person. I don't hear voices and stuff, but I get these impressions. I said, no, I actually want to go inside my house. I feel the energy of SportsCenter coming upon me in this very moment. And I actually want to go check on my 49ers. And so I did. And I went inside my house, and it took about 2 weeks till one day I opened up the door and I saw, his name was David, standing across the street. I was right at that tipping point that Gladwell talks about. And I walked across the street and I walked up to him and I said, hey, I'm concerned about you. He said, why? I said, well, I've been looking at you for the last 2 years, and I feel like within the next 6 months, you're either going to be dead or in prison. I want to offer myself to you as a friend, so that doesn't have to be your end. And totally trying to get out of it, I said, so here's my card. You give me a call whenever it is you want to talk. And he said, what about later on today? And I said, later on today? I was just trying to do the right thing, all right? And honestly, what I told him, I have a meeting. Y'all heard all the self-righteous folks groan. That was cute. And so I got with him the next day, and I took him to Starbucks, because that's obviously where he hangs out every day. And I took him to Starbucks. I said, what do you want to drink? He said, it was a maca. I said, a mocha? He said, yeah. I said, you ever been here before? He said, no, I've never been here before. And I recognized that although he and I lived in the same neighborhood, we actually lived in two totally different worlds. We got back in my car, and I asked him, I said, listen, I want to help you, but, you got to keep it real with me. How many felonies do you have? Why do you say I have a felony? I said, come on, man. How many felonies do you have? I got one. I said, drug case or a gun case? Gun case. So you got a gun on you right now? He said, yeah. I said, make sure the safety's on so you don't shoot yourself in my car, all right? So here we are driving down the street with a gun and 2 mochas. It's a very odd situation. We get down to the one stop I was leading at that time, and I'm able to help him access some services and relationships and start his life moving forward in a more positive way. 2 to 3 times a week, he would ride with me. We'd go down to my office so that he could access a lot of the services that we had in our building. So one day we're coming back home, and he looks at me and he says, hey, man, thank you. I said, for what? He said, I don't know, whatever it is you call this. And I realized that my young brother didn't necessarily have the language to define relationship. We pulled back in front of his grandmother's house. I let him out, and I pulled back in front of my house. And that's when it hit me that for David, Hope had been living in the neighborhood for 2 years, but it didn't make it to him until I crossed the street. Now, it's at this moment that the violin begins to cue up and the The night's message comes up and I tell you that David's become the director of the organization I used to lead. But you know that's not the truth. The reality is, a few months later, I was sitting on my couch with the front door open. I see him anchored behind a telephone pole shooting at somebody at the corner, and he's now incarcerated. Now, I remember that day. Became so frustrated with myself, with the sacred. Why did I have to go across the street? Why did I have to engage? He ended up in the same condition and the same position if I never would have engaged him before. Then that's when I realized that when I went across the street for David, I wasn't just going across the street for David. I was also going across the street for myself. See, it was the hope and partnership with David that gave me the agency to be one of the ones that really worked to scale up our violence reduction strategy in Oakland, lead to a 40% sustainable reduction in homicides over the last several years, recognizing that the only people that can keep our communities safe are the young men themselves. It's not going to be by over-policing. It's that hope and partnership that gave me the agency to step past my trauma into the space with law enforcement, to begin to train them around the historical and generational impacts of policing in communities of color and implicit bias, and find ways to create partnership and trust-building spaces. That same hope and partnership that moved me into the space with the protesters and the activists, to hang in that space and follow the leadership of young people as they continue to push us to a more vibrant democracy. You see, this is where we are. Partnership is the new expression of heroism that is absolutely critical. And we've got to do it not because we want to, but because we have to. So the question is, can we begin to create partnership spaces and circles that are prepared and built to hold the tension? Can we create rooms and spaces? Can we resource opportunities that bring in directly impacted people, law enforcement, community representatives, and yes, we the protesters? Can we invite people to listen longer than feels comfortable? We're living in a difficult moment. The moment is ours. There's no one else to depend on it. And the only way we're going to get through it is together. I hope to meet you in the crosswalk.